Have you ever noticed how your mind doesn't stop, even when everything around you is silent? As if there was a constant voice pulling you to worries that haven't even happened yet, creating scenarios that tire you out even before the day starts. It's as if, no matter how hard you try to rest, something inside you insists on continuing to think, analyze, try to predict, try to control. And deep down, you know it's robbing you of your peace, and the more you try to solve it inside your head, the more trapped you feel. Thoughts repeat, rotate, return to the same place, like a cycle that never ends. At night, the body even lies down, but the mind remains awake, revisiting words, decisions, fears, as if he were trying to find an answer that never comes. And this tires the soul, tightens the chest, weakens faith without you realizing it. But there is something that few see, something that has always been in front of their eyes, but that almost no one really learns to access. A silent spiritual principle, hidden within the deepest teachings of Jesus, that has the power to interrupt this cycle and bring a peace that does not depend on explanations. It's not complicated, but it's also not something that the anxious mind can easily understand. There is a way, and it doesn't start when you understand everything, but when you decide to let go of the controller. There is a way out of this constant restlessness, and it is not in thinking better, but in trusting differently, and that changes everything. Because there is a spiritual key that has been left as a code, simple in appearance but powerful in essence. A truth that, when applied, silences the inner chaos and repositions the heart in a resting place that many have forgotten exists. And today, something is going to be revealed here that can change the way you deal with your thoughts forever. It's not theory. It is a living, ancient, tried and true secret. And if you stay until the end, there is a great chance that even today, before going to sleep, you will feel a peace that you have not felt for a long time. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all your ways, and he will direct your paths. Proverbs 3:5-6. On this path we're now beginning, you'll discover how the Bible itself reveals practical and spiritual ways to calm the mind and strengthen a real trust in God. Even when everything seems confusing, each teaching here has been chosen to touch deep areas of your life, bringing direction, relief, and a sense of security that is not dependent on circumstances. As you move forward, you will realize that they are not just old stories, but living answers to what you are facing today, as if every word is being directed exactly at you. And maybe it's no coincidence that you're here now. There is a greater purpose guiding you to this moment. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. You help this message to reach other people who are also in need of this peace. You will keep him in peace whose mind is set on you, for he trusteth in thee. Isaiah 26:3. There is a dangerous point that almost no one realizes, and perhaps you are living in it right now without realizing it. Overthinking gives you the feeling that you are in control, as if every analysis, every imagined scenario, every calculated possibility can protect you from mistakes and future pain. It seems prudent. It seems like wisdom. But deep down, it is just a silent illusion that gradually moves you away from trust in God. Because the more you try to control everything in your mind, the less room you give for God to act. It's as if, without realizing it, you take a place that was never yours. And that is tiring, tires deeply. The mind is overloaded, the heart restless, and the soul loses that rest that only exists when one truly trusts. Jesus showed this in such a simple but profound way in the home of two sisters. Martha was busy, running from one side to the other, trying to handle everything, worried about every detail. Meanwhile, Maria did something that at first glance seemed strange. She just stopped. She sat at the feet of Jesus and chose to be present, to listen, to connect. And at that moment, Jesus did not praise Martha's effort nor her dedication to making everything perfect. He revealed something that completely breaks the logic of the anxious mind. "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and weary about many things, but only one is necessary, and Mary has chosen the good part, which will not be taken away from her." Luke 10:41-42. Notice this carefully. Martha wasn't doing anything wrong, but she was carrying a weight that God never asked her to carry. And maybe that's exactly what's happening to you. You're not making mistakes by thinking, by wanting to get it right, by trying to avoid problems. But he is burdening himself by trying to control that which only God can lead. Thinking too much doesn't bring you closer to the solution. It often only takes you away from peace. And the agitated mind begins to mask something deeper, a difficulty in trusting completely, because truly trusting requires letting go. It requires giving up understanding everything. It requires resting even without having all the answers. And this is where almost everyone gets stuck, because letting go of the controller seems too risky, but continuing to try to control everything is costing you too much. Perhaps today you are being asked to do the same as Mary did. Stop, breathe, and choose God's presence above all the answers your mind insists on seeking. There is a lightness to this place that you have not yet fully experienced. And if that message is messing with something inside you, don't ignore it. Perhaps it is exactly the moment that God has chosen to speak to you more clearly. If you felt this touch, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word is the first step to a profound change that starts from the inside out. And if the problem isn't that God isn't speaking, but rather that you can't hear, this question can be uncomfortable, because deep down, many believe that God answers through great signs, immediate answers, or extraordinary events. But the truth is that, most of the time, God's voice does not come in the noise. It comes in the silence that almost no one can sustain. The mind that thinks too much creates a constant noise. They are thoughts about the past, concerns about the future, internal dialogues that never cease. And in this scenario, trying to hear God becomes like trying to hear a whisper in the midst of a screaming crowd. It's not that God has moved away. It's just that the internal noise was too loud. And this is not something new. One of the greatest prophets in the Bible went through exactly this. Elijah reached a point of emotional exhaustion so deep that he could no longer discern God's leading. He had faced intense challenges, won spiritual battles, but now he was tired, confused, and mentally overwhelmed. Then God calls him to a meeting, not in the midst of the hustle and bustle, but in a place of silence. And what happens there breaks all human expectations. A strong wind passes by, capable of breaking rocks, but God was not in him. An earthquake shakes everything around, but God was not there. An intense fire arises, but still, God does not manifest himself in these signs until something almost imperceptible happens, a gentle, delicate, silent breeze. And it is there that God speaks. And after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. This reveals something powerful that many ignore. God does not compete with the chaos of your mind. He doesn't scream to be heard. He whispers, and only those who learn to quiet down can perceive. Maybe you're expecting clear answers, visible signs, unquestionable directions, while God is trying to speak in a simple, calm, direct way to the heart. But for this, there is a requirement that almost no one wants to accept. Silence the mind. And silencing the mind does not mean stopping thinking by force. It means trusting enough that you don't have to understand everything all the time. It means making space within yourself, slowing down, allowing the heart to calm down. Because it is in this place that divine direction begins to become clear. There is a difference between seeking answers and being available to listen. And as you continue to try to figure it all out in your head, you may be missing out on what God has been trying to show you for a long time. If this word is awakening in you a sincere desire to hear God's voice more clearly, then turn it into an attitude now. Comment, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." Write as a prayer, as a surrender, and leave your like on this video, because by doing so, you help other people to also learn to recognize the soft voice of the Master in the midst of silence. There is something inside you that always asks for an explanation before taking a step, as if it were necessary to understand all the details, predict all the paths, and ensure that nothing will go wrong before trusting. And without realizing it, you postpone decisions, stop movements, and carry an increasing mental weight, because your mind has been conditioned to believe that it is only safe to act when everything makes sense. But true faith doesn't work that way. It begins right where the explanation ends. And it is here that many get lost, because they want to feel security and then trust, when in fact God's way requires the opposite, to trust first, to then understand. It breaks human logic, confronts the desire for control, and exposes something profound: the difficulty of delivering the unknown into God's hands. Abraham lived this kind of faith. He received a call that didn't come with details, didn't come with visible guarantees, didn't come with a map. It was just one direction and a choice: to stay where he was with everything predictable, or to obey a voice that called him to something he could not see. And the most impressive thing is not the destination, is the decision. By faith, Abraham, being called, obeyed, going to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. Hebrews 11:8. Understand this in depth. He left without knowing it, not because he was inconsequential, but because he trusted the one who was guiding him. This is the difference that changes everything. Faith does not ignore reality, but chooses not to depend on it to act. Now, think sincerely. How many times have you been stuck, hoping to understand better, waiting for a clearer sign, hoping to feel more secure, while God had already shown you enough to take the next step? This excess of thoughts creates a silent paralysis. You believe you are being cautious, but you are actually being held back from moving forward, because the more you try to understand everything beforehand, the farther you are from living what God has already prepared. The faith that transforms is not the one that only exists when everything is clear. It is the one that arises even when there are still doubts. It is the one that walks even when the path is not completely visible. It is the one that trusts in God's character above its own need for control. And maybe today there is something inside you being called to take a step. Not when it all makes sense, but now, even with questions, even with uncertainties, even without all the answers. If this is touching you in any way, save this moment as a turning point, and, in a simple way, almost like a whisper of faith, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Sometimes a decision starts with a word, and this word can be the beginning of a new path that you cannot yet see, but that is already being prepared. There is a type of weight that many people carry every day without realizing it. It is not in the hands, it is not in the shoulders, but it is in the mind. It is the weight of tomorrow, the constant need to predict, control, anticipate every detail of what has not even happened yet. And this consumes energy, takes away sleep, silently steals peace. Because anxiety doesn't come making noise. It settles little by little, disguised as worry, disguised as responsibility, disguised as care. You start by thinking of something simple. And when you realize it, you're already imagining scenarios, creating problems, trying to find solutions to situations that may never exist. And the more you think, the farther you are from tranquility, because the mind is never satisfied. It always finds a new reason to remain restless. But there is something that needs to be understood clearly. This weight was not given to you by God. At no time did God ask you to carry the future on your back. On the contrary, Jesus made it very clear, in a direct, simple way, but profoundly liberating. Do not worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will take care of itself. Enough of your evil every day. Matthew 6:34. Notice the depth of this. Each day already has its own challenges, its own responsibilities. When you try to live today and tomorrow at the same time, you double the weight, overwhelm the mind, and weaken the heart. Anxiety is born exactly in this place. When you push the limit of the present and try to take control that doesn't belong to you. And here's something that can confront but also liberate. Thinking too much about tomorrow is often a silent way of not completely trusting God. Because deep down, it's as if you're saying that you need to make sure everything will work out, instead of resting in the assurance that God is already taking care of it. Trusting God does not mean ignoring responsibilities, but it means living one day at a time with the certainty that He is already in the tomorrow that you have not even arrived yet. And when it becomes real inside of you, something changes. The mind slows down, the heart calms down, and life begins to flow more lightly. Maybe today you are tired precisely because you are trying to carry days that do not even exist yet. Maybe your tiredness isn't physical, be it emotional, mental, spiritual. And the solution is not to think more, but to let go more, to trust more, to live the now with God without trying to anticipate what only He can lead. If you've come this far, it's not by chance. There is something being aligned within you at this time. And that's just the beginning. Stay with me until the end, because there is a special moment prepared where we will pray together, and you will be able to deliver everything that has weighed on your mind. It may be just what you need to feel a peace that you haven't felt in a long time. There is a silent idea that many people carry without realizing it, that it will only be possible to have peace when everything is resolved, when problems disappear, when life finally comes into order. But this expectation creates a dangerous trap, because life never stops completely. Challenges keep arising, and those who condition peace to the absence of problems end up living in constant restlessness. True peace is not born when the scenario changes. It is born when your perception changes, and that's exactly what God's presence does. It does not depend on what is happening around you, but transforms what is happening inside you. David understood this in a profound way. His life was not peaceful, quite the opposite. He faced persecution, betrayal, wars, moments of loneliness and real fear. There were periods when he had to flee to survive, sleep in improvised places, live without knowing what would happen the next day. And yet, in the midst of all this, he wrote words that seemed to completely contradict the reality he was living in. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Psalms 46:1. Notice, David did not say that God was a distant help, nor something that appeared only when all was well. He said that God was present there in the midst of anguish. That changes everything, because it means that peace is not in the absence of the problem, but in the presence of God within the problem. And here's something that can transform the way you see your own life. Maybe what's missing isn't the immediate solution to your difficulties, but the awareness that you're not alone within them. When the mind is agitated, it focuses on the size of the problem. It amplifies fear, repeats negative scenarios, creates a sense of constant urgency. But when the heart is anchored in God's presence, something begins to quietly change. The problem may even be there, but it no longer dominates your thoughts in the same way. It's like finding shelter in the midst of a storm. The rain doesn't stop immediately, the wind still blows, but you're protected. There is security. there is rest. There is a place where the mind no longer has to fight all the time, and this place is not physical. It is spiritual. Maybe you've been looking for answers, solutions, paths, but today he is being invited to something deeper, to seek presence, because it is in it that the mind finds real rest. It is there that the heart slows down. It is there that you realize that you don't have to carry everything alone. And if that makes sense to you right now, turn this moment into a step of faith. Declare in the comments, "Lord, I receive your peace." Write as a sincere delivery, and leave your like, because by doing so you help other people to also find that refuge that calms the mind and strengthens the heart. There is something going on inside your mind that may be going unnoticed, but it is influencing everything in your life. Not every thought that arises in you is true, and more than that, not every thought comes from God. This is one of the most ignored secrets when talking about faith, because many people automatically believe everything they think, without questioning the origin, without filtering, without discerning. And that's exactly where the problem begins. A thought appears, saying that it won't work. Another one arises, bringing fear, doubt, insecurity. Then comes that feeling of guilt, of incapacity, of condemnation. And little by little these thoughts accumulate, creating an internal narrative that feels real, but which in fact may be completely out of line with God's truth. The mind, when it is not watched, becomes an open field. And any type of thought can enter, settle, and begin to influence emotions and decisions. And the most dangerous thing is that many of these thoughts come disguised. They seem logical, they seem prudent, they even seem necessary, but they carry fear, weight, and confusion. The Bible reveals something extremely powerful about this. It doesn't say to accept all thoughts. It teaches how to confront them, bringing every mind captive to the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians 10:5. This means that you don't have to be held hostage to your mind. There is spiritual authority to analyze, filter, and even reject thoughts that are not aligned with God's truth. But for this, it is necessary to develop discernment. To discern is to perceive the difference between what comes from God and what does not. And there is a clear pattern. What comes from God generates peace, even when it confronts. What does not come from God generates confusion, constant fear, emotional weight. Perhaps you are carrying thoughts that should never have remained inside you. Perhaps he believed lies that were repeated so much that they came to seem true. And this has fueled anxiety, insecurity, and this constant need to try to control everything. But today there is a different invitation, not to think more, but to think better, to submit every thought to the truth of God, not to automatically accept what arises in the mind, but to question, filter, and align. Because when the mind aligns with the truth, something changes inside you. Peace begins to take the place of fear. Clarity begins to replace confusion. And that feeling of being lost begins to give way to a firm direction. If this message is touching something inside you, understand that this is not by chance. Maybe it's God showing you that there's a new way to deal with your thoughts. And you can start this now. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, this message reaches other people who also need to learn how to win this internal battle. Do this as an act of faith, helping to spread this truth that can free so many minds and restore so many hearts. There is a time in life when everything seems unstable, as if you were surrounded by uncertainty, not knowing exactly what the next step will be, no guarantees, no visible security. And it is in this scenario that the mind begins to work even harder, trying to find answers, predict paths, avoid risks. But the more you look at the circumstances, the more the fear grows and confidence begins to weaken. This is exactly what happened to Pedro. It all started with a simple invitation, but completely out of logic. Jesus was before him, walking on the water in the midst of a scenario that naturally generated fear. And then comes a word. Just one word. Come. There was no explanation. There were no detailed instructions. There were no human guarantees. There was only the presence of Jesus and a call to trust. And Pedro does something that few would have the courage to do. He gets off the boat. He steps on what would be impossible for any rational mind, and for a moment he lives something supernatural. He walks on water, and he said, "Come." And Peter got down from the boat and walked on the water to come to Jesus. Matthew 14:29. But something changes along the way. The text says that he began to feel the strong wind. That is, he took the focus off Jesus and looked back at the circumstances. And at that moment, fear entered. The mind began to interpret the scenario, to analyze the danger, to remember the impossibility. And what once seemed possible by faith began to crumble before the thoughts. But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid. And when he began to go to the bottom, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." Matthew 14:30. Understand this in depth. Peter did not sink because the water changed, nor because Jesus was no longer there. He began to sink the moment he shifted focus. When he began to pay more attention to the problem than to the presence of Jesus. And this connects directly with what you may be experiencing today. How many times have you even started with faith, trusting, believing, moving forward? But halfway through, thoughts began to grow, circumstances began to weigh down, and fear began to speak louder. Overthinking the problem makes it seem bigger than it really is. And the bigger the problem seems, the lower your faith becomes. But there is something powerful about this story that cannot be ignored. Even as Peter began to sink, Jesus was there. The presence has not disappeared. The aid was not withdrawn. And the moment he cried out, there was a response. This shows that your journey does not depend on perfection, but on direction. It's not about never feeling afraid, but about knowing where to look when it appears. Maybe today you need to adjust the focus again, take your eyes off the wind, the circumstances, the uncertainties, and to look back at Jesus, because that's what sustains you. And if this message reminded you of someone who is also facing moments of uncertainty, don't keep it to yourself. Write that person's name in the comments. Let's unite faith, present each name to God, and believe together that just as Peter was sustained, lives will also be reached by this same presence that never fails. There is a truth that can completely change the way you live every day, but that many people ignore. Your mind does not transform all at once. It is renewed little by little. And while you don't understand this, you end up getting frustrated because you expect to feel immediate peace. You expect negative thoughts to simply disappear. You expect everything to align automatically. But what God proposes is not magic. It is a process. Real transformation begins within, and it happens when you decide to no longer accept any thought as truth. Because, if you stop to observe, you will realize that many of the thoughts that dominate you today were built over time. There are repetitions, beliefs, accumulated fears, and all of this needs to be replaced, not ignored. This is where a powerful spiritual principle that the Apostle Paul clearly revealed comes in. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans 12:2. Notice that he doesn't just talk about changing behavior. He talks about renewing the mind, because it's impossible to live a different life with a mind that remains stuck in the same patterns. If the thoughts remain the same, the reactions will be the same, the emotions will be the same, and so is restlessness. To renew the mind means to replace every day what does not come from God with what comes from Him. It means exchanging fear for truth, doubt for promise, anxiety for trust. And this does not happen once. It happens daily, intentionally. Maybe you're hoping to feel peace and then believe that something has changed. But the path is the opposite. You decide to align your thoughts with God's truth. And over time, peace begins to settle within you. It's like invisible training. At first, it seems difficult because the mind insists on going back to the old patterns. But as you persist, something starts to adjust. What once dominated you loses strength. What seemed impossible to control begins to become lighter. And little by little you realize that you no longer react in the same way. He no longer despairs so easily. He no longer gets lost in his thoughts as before. Not because the problems have disappeared, but because your mind is being transformed. And that changes everything. Because the peace you seek is not outside. It begins within, in this silent process of renewal. One day at a time, one thought at a time, one choice at a time. And maybe today is the day to start this process with more awareness, with more intention, with more surrender. Because God doesn't just want to give you peace. He wants to teach you how to live in it. None of this is happening by chance. If you have come this far, there is something being worked on within you. Stay until the end, because there is still something very special prepared, a moment of deep connection where you can deliver your mind, your thoughts, and everything that has been worrying you directly into God's hands. There is a moment in the journey when everything seems too confusing. You look ahead and you don't see direction. You look around and you don't find answers. And inside you, there's that restlessness that asks all the time, where should I go now? And the more this question is repeated, the more the mind tries to build paths, imagine possibilities, predict decisions, as if it were possible to find clarity just by thinking more. But the truth is that God's direction does not work the way the human mind expects. Often, God does not reveal the entire path. He reveals the next step. And this directly confronts the need for control, because the mind wants guarantees, it wants total security, it wants to see the beginning, the middle, and the end before it makes any move. But God works in another way. He guides you as you walk. The people of Israel lived exactly that. They were in the desert, a place where there were no clear references, there were no defined roads, there were no maps. Humanly speaking, it was impossible to know where to go. And yet they weren't lost, because God was guiding, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to guide them by the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to enlighten them, that they might walk day and night. Exodus 13:21. Notice the depth of it. God did not deliver a detailed plan to them. He did not explain every step of the journey. He simply put himself ahead, showing the way at the right time. During the day, a cloud. During the night, a pillar of fire. Enough direction to continue, but not to control. And maybe that's exactly what's happening in your life right now. You may be waiting for a complete answer, a clear signal about everything, an absolute certainty before moving forward, while God is already showing you enough to take the next step. But the excess of thoughts makes you doubt, question, hesitate, because the mind wants more than what God is offering at that moment. But trusting God is accepting to be guided without having to see everything. It is to understand that He is not lost, even when you feel lost. It is to recognize that His faithfulness does not depend on your understanding, and that even in the desert there is direction. Anxiety grows when you try to anticipate the entire path, but peace begins to emerge when you accept to walk one step at a time, knowing that God is already ahead. And that changes the way you see uncertainty, because it is no longer a place of fear, and it becomes a space where God reveals His presence more intensely. Maybe today you don't need all the answers. You may just need to trust that the same hand that guided you in the past is still guiding now. And that, even without seeing the final destination, you are not without direction. Because when God goes ahead, the path, even if unknown, will always be safe. There is something deeper behind this restless mind that does not stop thinking. Excessive thinking is not always born only from the attempt to control the future. Often it is born from past wounds that have not yet healed. They are invisible marks, experiences that left pain, rejections that were not fully overcome, moments that were stored inside the soul and continue to echo in the form of repetitive thoughts. And without realizing it, you try to solve these pains by thinking more, analyzing more, trying to understand everything that happened, trying to find explanations that bring relief. But the more you go back into these thoughts, the more stuck you get in them. Because there are pains that cannot be solved with logic, are resolved with delivery, the mind insists on revisiting what the heart has not yet been able to release. And this is where many get tired, because they fight internal battles using only their own strength, without realizing that the healing they seek is not in the mind. It is in the soul. And the soul only finds rest when it is placed before God in a sincere way, without filters, without masks. Anna experienced exactly this kind of pain. She carried a deep anguish, something that no one around could fully understand. It was a silent, constant pain that accompanied her every day, and she could have tried to deal with it in many ways. He could have kept it to himself. He could have hardened his heart. He could have lost himself in his own thoughts. But she did something different. She decided to pour out her soul before God. "No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have not drunk wine or strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord." 1 Samuel 1:15. Notice the intensity of this. She didn't just take words. She took what was inside. Without trying to organize, without trying to explain perfectly, without trying to control the form, she simply opened herself completely before God. And that's what transforms. Because healing doesn't start when you understand everything. It starts when you surrender everything, when you stop trying to solve on your own what is already too heavy, and allow God to enter that deeper place. Perhaps what's feeding your restless mind today isn't just what's ahead, but that which is left behind and has not yet been healed. And as long as this is not treated, the thoughts keep coming back, like a cycle that repeats itself. But there is a different way, a path where you don't have to carry all of this alone, where pain can be delivered, where the soul can be restored, where the heart can learn to trust again. And when the soul begins to be healed, something naturally changes. Anxiety decreases, the mind slows down, and that constant need to think about everything begins to lose strength. If that word has come to you and touched on something deeper, don't ignore it. Perhaps it is exactly time to take this step of delivery. And in a simple way, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Let this be your statement today, even if silent inside, but true before Him. There is a type of distance that is not immediately noticed. It's not physical, it's not visible, but it's profoundly real. It is when the person continues to do everything right on the outside, maintaining habits, following routines, even talking about God. But inside, something is no longer the same as before. The connection has weakened, the intensity has decreased, and the heart, little by little, moved away without making a sound. And the most dangerous thing is that this can happen without the person realizing it at first. The mind begins to become more restless, thoughts faster, peace more distant. And many times we try to solve this with more effort, more control, more attempts to organize life. But the root is not in the lack of discipline. It is in the spiritual disconnection. The Church of Ephesus lived just that. It was an active, committed, works-filled, persevering church, steadfast in many things. Humanly speaking, everything seemed to be right. But God, who sees beyond appearance, has revealed something that completely changes perspective. But I have this against you, that you have left your first love. Remember therefore from where thou hast fallen, and repent, and do the first works. Revelation 2:4-5. Notice the depth of it. It wasn't a lack of activity, it was a lack of connection. They hadn't abandoned everything. They had lost the essential, the first love. And what is this first love? It is that place where everything was simpler, more sincere, more alive, where God's presence was sufficient, where there was not so much analysis, so much concern, so much distraction. It was a direct, true relationship without mental overload. When this connection weakens, the mind tries to compensate. And that's where excessive thoughts, the need to control, disguised anxiety arise. Because the heart, far from the source, begins to seek security elsewhere. But the solution is not to do more, is about to return. To go back to that place where God was not just a part of life, but the center of it. To go back to the simplicity of being with Him without having to understand everything, without having to control everything, just trusting. And the text itself shows the way. Remember, recognize, take a stand, and resume. It's not complicated, but it requires a decision. It requires sincerity. It requires acknowledging that perhaps at some point the connection has been lost. And when that return happens, something starts to line up again. The mind slows down, the heart is strengthened, and peace begins to return naturally. Not because everything around you has changed, but because inside you something has been restored. Maybe today is not about looking for new answers, but about going back to what was once real inside you, because it is in this place that confidence is reborn and the excess of thoughts loses strength. If you're here so far, there's a bigger reason. God is leading you on a path of restoration that begins from the inside out. Do not leave this video before receiving everything that is yet to be revealed, because something special is being prepared to touch your life deeply. There is something that needs to be said clearly, even if it bothers you a little. Not all the restlessness you feel comes from outside. It is often born from decisions that you already know you need to make. But keep postponing. The mind begins to be burdened not only by doubts, but by escapes. Running away from what God has already shown generates a kind of inner confusion that cannot be resolved with more thought, is solved with positioning. Because the more you postpone, the more the mind tries to justify, explain, negotiate, and this creates a silent wear. You think, rethink, analyze, create scenarios, but deep down, He already knows what needs to be done. And it is exactly this resistance that fuels anxiety. Jonas lived this intensely. God gave a clear, direct, straightforward direction. There was no question about what had to be done. But instead of complying, he decided to flee. And it wasn't just a physical escape, it was a spiritual escape. But Jonah arose to flee from the presence of the Lord to Tarshish. Jonah 1:3. Understand this in depth. He wasn't just avoiding a mission, he was trying to get away from what God had already set before him. And from that moment on, everything began to fall apart. Storm, fear, confusion. Nothing else made sense. Because when you run away from God's leading, the mind never finds rest. It may even seem that you are buying time, that you are avoiding something difficult, but inside, the restlessness increases. The heart becomes heavy, thoughts intensify, and that feeling that something is out of place does not go away. And maybe that's happening to you right now. Maybe there's a decision you already know you need to make. An attitude that has already been shown, a step that is already clear within you. But fear, doubt, or even overthinking are keeping you in the same place. But there is a spiritual time for each thing. And when you don't respond within that time, the mind starts carrying the weight of that resistance. It's not just indecision. It is misalignment. The urgency you feel is not ordinary anxiety. It may be God calling you to act. And the more you try to ignore it, the harder it becomes to find peace, because peace is not in avoiding what God has asked for. It is in obeying, even if it is challenging. Maybe today is not a day to think more. Be a day to decide, to stop running away, to stop postponing, to stop negotiating what has already been revealed within you. Because when you align yourself with God, even what seemed difficult starts to make sense. The mind calms down, the heart is strengthened, and the direction becomes clear again. If this word spoke directly to you, perhaps it is time to acknowledge it simply but sincerely. Write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a word can represent a decision that completely changes the course of your life. There is a silent prison that prevents many people from moving forward, and it is not in the present, is in the past. They are memories, mistakes, choices, moments that still echo in the mind as if they defined who you are today. And the more you think about it, the more it seems that there is no way out, as if your history was already marked, as if it were not possible to change course. But this is one of the greatest illusions that the mind can create, because God doesn't work with human labels. He works with transformation, and perhaps the greatest example of this is the life of Paul. Before he became one of the greatest apostles, he was the exact opposite of what one would imagine to be used by God. He persecuted Christians, approved condemnations, walked in the opposite direction of what God wanted. If one looked at his history at that time, they would say that there was no possibility of change. But God does not see as man sees. In an unexpected encounter, everything changed. It wasn't a long process. It wasn't something built little by the mind. It was a direct impact of God's presence that completely transformed his direction. The one who persecuted began to announce. He who destroyed began to build. The one who was lost found purpose. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Understand what this means. It's not a partial improvement. It's not an attempt to adjust the past. It is a new identity. It's a new beginning that does not depend on what is left behind. But here is the point where many get stuck. They continue to think too much about who they were, about what they did, about what could have been different. And this prevents them from living what God is already ready to do now. Because as long as you keep your eyes on the past, you lose sight of what is being built in the present. God does not ignore his history, but he doesn't want you to get stuck in it. There is something new being prepared, but to live it, it is necessary to trust that the transformation is real, that the past does not define the future, that what God begins, he also sustains. Maybe you are seeing yourself as someone who made too many mistakes, who missed opportunities, who made decisions that still matter, but God is seeing you as someone who can start over, and that's not based on your effort. It is based on his power. Overthinking the past keeps you in the same place. Trusting God opens up a path that you have not yet fully seen. And this is what transforms an ordinary story into a living testimony. It's not the absence of mistakes. It is the presence of God changing everything. If this message has reached you, there is something being awakened within your heart. It's not just about understanding, it's about living this transformation. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed may be exactly the missing step for you to see your own story in a completely new way. There is a type of transformation that does not make noise, does not draw attention, and many times is not even noticed at the moment it is happening. And it is precisely this type of transformation that God uses the most, Because while the human mind seeks immediate signs, quick answers, and visible changes, God works on a deeper level, where the eyes do not see, but everything is being prepared. And this is where many get confused, because they start to think that nothing is happening. They look inside themselves, observe life around them, and, as they do not perceive rapid changes, the mind accelerates again, trying to understand, trying to force results, trying to control the process. But what God does not keep pace with human anxiety. Jesus explained this in a simple but extremely profound way when talking about a seed. And he sleeps and rises up night or day, and the seed sprouts and grows, and he knows not how. Mark 4:27. Notice what is being revealed here. Growth happens even when it is not understood. The seed is there, under the ground, invisible, silent, but live. There is a process going on that does not depend on human perception. It does not depend on control. It does not depend on anxiety. And this applies directly to your life. Maybe you're expecting to feel something different right away. Perhaps you are looking for clear signs that you are changing, that you are advancing, that God is at work. But the truth is that many of the greatest transformations begin quietly. While you live day by day, while facing your challenges, while you keep moving forward, even without understanding everything, God is at work within you, adjusting thoughts, strengthening the heart, aligning emotions, preparing something that cannot yet be fully seen. The problem is that the mind wants to follow each step. He wants to understand how it is happening, when it will happen, what will happen. And when he doesn't get these answers, he begins to doubt the process. But trusting in God is also accepting not to know. It is resting even when there is no visible evidence. It is to keep walking even when it seems that nothing has changed. Because faith is not based on what is seen. It is sustained by what is being done, even if in secret. And there is something powerful about this. The most solid growth is the one that happens without haste, without pressure, without human interference. It is the one that God leads at the right time, in the right way. Maybe today you just need to keep going, without trying to speed up, without trying to understand everything, without trying to control every detail. Just trust that the seed has already been planted. And that, without even realizing it, something inside you has already started to grow. And at the right time, what is invisible today will become evident. But until then, there is a silent learning going on, that of trusting God even when the mind cannot explain it. There is a load that many are trying to bear alone, and this has further intensified the restless mind. Because when you isolate yourself, when you keep everything to yourself, when you try to solve everything internally, thoughts gain more strength, more space, more intensity. The mind begins to spin without interruption, creating scenarios, amplifying worries, and increasing a weight that could be shared. And maybe you believe that you have to deal with everything alone, that it is easier not to talk, not to expose, not to divide. But that's not the way God planned the spiritual walk. From the beginning, God showed that the journey of faith was not meant to be lonely. The disciples walked together, shared experiences, shared challenges, learned from each other. There was a strength in this union that went beyond the natural, a spiritual support that balanced the mind and strengthened the heart. All who believed were together and had everything in common. Acts 2:44. Realized that it wasn't just about being close. It was about walking in unity. This creates an environment where the weight decreases, where the mind finds rest, where what seemed too big begins to be divided. Because when you share a burden, it no longer weighs in the same way. And this does not mean depending on people more than on God, but understanding that God also uses people. Sometimes a right word, a simple piece of advice, a presence by your side. It can bring clarity that your mind alone could not achieve. Isolation feeds thoughts. Communion brings balance. Maybe you're carrying something that you didn't need to carry on its own. Perhaps there is an internal battle that could be lighter if it were divided. But the excess of thoughts makes you believe that you need to solve everything on your own, that no one would understand, that it is better to keep it. And little by little, this increases the internal pressure. But there is a different way, a path where you allow yourself to be helped, where you open up, where you walk together, and that doesn't weaken your faith, strengthen, because God manifests himself also through connections, through people he puts on the path. When you understand that, something changes. The mind slows down, the heart gets stronger, and that feeling of being alone begins to fade. Perhaps today is the time to reflect on this, about who has walked with you, about how you have dealt with what you feel. Because the answer you're looking for may not just be within you, it may be in a connection that God has already placed around you. And if that message has gotten through to you, think about how many other people need to hear it right now. Just as this word reached you, it can reach many other hearts that are facing the same silence, the same overload, the same search for peace. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and activating the bell, you become part of something bigger, helping that message get to exactly where it needs to go. There is a silent barrier that prevents many people from advancing the purpose God has for them, and that barrier is not in the circumstances. It's in the way they see themselves. It is that inner voice that insists on saying that you are not capable, that you are not ready, that you do not have what is necessary. And the more you think about your limitations, the more they seem to grow, to the point of completely paralyzing you. The mind begins to list failures, insecurities, past mistakes, personal difficulties. And little by little, you come to believe that you can't go further, that God can use other people, but not you. And this creates a silent resistance to the call that is already within you. But God has never worked with perfect people. Moses is living proof of this. When God called him, he did not answer with confidence, answered with doubts. He questioned her ability, her way of speaking, her authority. He looked at himself and could only see limitations. And in a way, that's very human, because the natural tendency is to evaluate the call based on one's own ability. But God doesn't call based on what you have. He calls based on what he is. And God's answer to Moses reveals something powerful that completely changes the way we see this process. Go now, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. Exodus 4:12. Notice this carefully. God did not deny Moses' limitations, but neither did he place them as a hindrance. He simply showed that the ability would come from him, that what seemed insufficient would be supplied on the way. And that changes everything, because the problem is not in having limitations. It is in allowing them to have more weight than God's leading. Thinking too much about what you can't do prevents you from seeing what God can do through you. And maybe today there is something being placed before you, an opportunity, a direction, a calling. But your mind is trying to convince you that you are not capable, that he is not prepared, that it won't work. But trusting God means accepting that you don't have to have everything ready before you start. It means understanding that strength does not come from you, but from him, that security is not in your ability, but in his presence by your side. Moses only found out what he was capable of after he decided to obey. And this remains true to this day. Capacity reveals itself on the path, not before it. Maybe what's holding you back isn't the lack of conditions, but the excess of thoughts about what you believe you don't have. And this is preventing you from living something that has already been prepared. But when you decide to trust, something changes. Insecurity loses strength, courage begins to emerge, and what seemed impossible begins to become a reality step by step. Because God does not call those who are able, He empowers those he chooses to call. There is a space in life that few know how to cross with peace, the waiting time. It is not the beginning, where everything begins with hope, nor the fulfillment, where everything makes sense. It's the middle, the silence between promise and fulfillment, and it is exactly in this place that the mind is most agitated. Because while nothing happens visibly, thoughts begin to arise. Will it work? Did I hear it wrong? Why is it taking so long? And little by little, what began with faith begins to be invaded by doubts. Not because God has changed, but because time is testing confidence. Sarah lived this process in a profound way. She received a promise that, humanly speaking, already seemed impossible. Time passed, the years advanced, and reality seemed to contradict what had been said. And this is where many give up. When what was promised seems too far from what is being lived, because waiting is not easy. Waiting requires something that the restless mind doesn't like: uncontrolled trust. You can't accelerate, you can't predict, you can't guarantee. And this makes thoughts try to fill this space with doubts, fears, and insecurities. But there is a truth that sustains those who decide to trust. God does not work in the time of anxiety. He works in the time of faithfulness. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Genesis 21:1-1. Notice every detail, as he had said, as he had promised. This shows that time has not nullified the promise. Silence did not mean absence. The delay was not forgotten. Everything happened exactly as God had spoken. And this changes the way you see your own waiting. Maybe today you are in that place, between what God has spoken and what has not yet happened, and your mind is trying to understand, to calculate, to question. But overthinking while waiting only weakens hope, because the wait was not made to be analyzed. It was made to be lived with confidence. God is not late. He does not forget. He does not lose track of time. And even when everything seems to be still, there is something being aligned, prepared, adjusted in a way that you can't yet see. Your part is not to understand the when, it is to continue trusting in the who. And when it becomes real within you, something changes. Anxiety decreases, internal pressure is relieved, and the heart finds rest, even without immediate responses. Because certainty doesn't come from what you see. It comes from the one who promised. If this word is finding its way within you, perhaps it is time to state it simply but truthfully. Write in the comments, God takes care of me. Let this be your affirmation today, even in the middle of the wait, even without seeing everything yet, but trusting that at the right time, everything will be fulfilled exactly as promised. There is a point in life when the person looks around and even inside themselves and feels that some things have no turning back. Dreams that have died, broken relationships, strength that has run out, as if certain areas had completely dried up. And when the mind begins to see this as definitive, it enters a dangerous cycle, trying to understand where everything went wrong, reliving losses, reinforcing the feeling that there is nothing more to do. And it is in this place that hope begins to fade, because, humanly speaking, when something comes to an end, there is no longer life expectancy there. The reasoning is simple. What is over? It's over. But God does not operate within this limited logic. He doesn't just see what's visible. He sees what can still be restored. And the vision he gave to the prophet Ezekiel reveals just that. A valley full of dry bones. It wasn't just bones. They were completely dry bones. This means that there was no life for a long time. There was no movement, there was no sign, there was no natural possibility of restoration. It was a final, closed, hopeless scenario. And then God asks a question that breaks all logic. Can these bones live? That question was not about what Ezekiel saw, it was about what God could do. And the answer comes loaded with power. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will bring the Spirit into you, and ye shall live. Ezekiel 37:5. Understand this in depth. God does not need favorable conditions to act. It does not depend on previous signs of life. It is not limited to the current state of affairs. Where all seems lost, he still sees possibility. Where all seems dry, he still releases life. And maybe today there are areas of your life that look like that valley, situations that you have already given as closed, feelings that have been erased, forces that you believe will not come back. And your mind, when looking at it, tries to accept it as definitive. But God is showing you something different. He doesn't just work with what's still alive. It also restores what already seems dead. And when that truth enters the heart, something begins to change. The mind slows down because it no longer needs to find human solutions for everything. The weight decreases because the responsibility is no longer only in your hands. And hope, which seemed distant, begins to be reborn in a silent but real way. Because if God can bring life to dry bones, it can also restore what you thought would never come back. Maybe today is not about understanding how this will happen, but about believing that it can still happen, that God keeps on acting even when you don't see it, that He continues to work, even in silence. And this renewed hope changes everything inside. What you're going to hear now may be more than a continuation. It may be just the answer you needed for something that is still stored inside you. Stay until the end, because there is a moment prepared that can deeply touch your life in a way you don't expect. There is a profound difference between God not speaking and you can't hear. And this difference changes everything. Because often the feeling is of silence, as if there was no direction, as if the sky was far away. But the truth is that God keeps speaking. The challenge is to develop a heart sensitive enough to recognize this voice in the midst of so many other noises. We live surrounded by distractions, worries, constant thoughts. The mind doesn't stop, always busy, always trying to solve something, always filled. And in this scenario, the voice of God, which is subtle, which is directed to the heart, ends up being muffled. Not because it ceased to exist, but because it does not find space. And that's exactly what happened to Samuel. At a young age, he heard someone calling his name. It was a clear, real, direct voice, but he did not recognize that he was God. He ran to Eli, thinking he was the one calling. This has happened more than once. Samuel listened, but he did not know how to discern until something changed. Eli realized what was happening and directed Samuel to respond in a different way. No longer running, no longer confusing, but positioning oneself with sensitivity and willingness to listen. And then, when the voice came again, everything lined up. Then the Lord came and stood there and called, as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant hears. 1 Samuel 3:10. Notice the strength of this answer. It's not just someone listening, it's someone available. Someone who puts himself in a position of listening, who opens up, who recognizes that that voice deserves attention. And maybe that's the point that needs to change within you. It's not that God isn't speaking. It's just that the restless mind is taking up too much space. Excessive thoughts create an invisible barrier. You even seek direction, you even ask for answers, but at the same time you continue to fill everything with worries, analyses, fears. Listening to God requires more than wanting answers. It requires a willingness to silence what is inside. And that doesn't mean the absence of thoughts, but it does mean choosing not to get caught up in them. It means creating space, slowing down, paying attention to what is deepest. Because the voice of God does not compete. It reveals itself to those who learn to listen. And when this starts to happen, something changes completely. Confidence grows because you realize that you are not being guided by chance. Doubt lessens because there is a clear direction being revealed, and that feeling of being lost begins to fade because God is not a distant God. He is a God who speaks, who directs, who communicates. But this communication does not happen in the midst of the hustle and bustle. It happens in the heart that quiets down. Perhaps today the invitation is not to seek more answers, but to learn to listen better. Because what you need to hear may already be being said. You just need to be ready to recognize it. There is a kind of peace that cannot be explained, just lived. And the most intriguing thing is that it does not depend on what is happening around it. Because, for the human mind, peace always needs favorable conditions, everything resolved, everything in place, everything under control. But God's peace completely breaks this logic. It appears where, of course, it should not exist. Paul and Silas lived this out in a way that defies any rational understanding. They were imprisoned, chained, in a dark, limited environment, without physical freedom, with no immediate prospect of change. Everything around pointed to pain, injustice, and suffering. Anyone in that situation would be overwhelmed by negative thoughts, fear, revolt, or despair. But something different happened. Instead of indulging in thoughts, instead of focusing on circumstances, they made a choice that changes everything, began to love it. In the midst of prison, in the midst of pain, in the midst of what seemed impossible to bear, they directed their hearts to the presence of God. And at that moment, something invisible began to happen. The prison was still there. But inside them, something was no longer the same. The presence of God filled that place in such a way that external currents no longer defined the internal state. They were trapped on the outside, but free inside. And this is what many still do not understand. True peace is not born when everything is resolved. It is born when the presence of God occupies the center of his life. When this happens, the mind loses the need to control everything because the heart finds rest in something greater than any problem. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Philippians 4:7. Notice this expression. It surpasses all understanding. This means that it makes no sense to human logic. It does not depend on explanation. It does not depend on circumstance. It does not depend on control. It is a peace that protects, that guards, that sustains, even when everything around it hasn't changed yet. Maybe today you are waiting for things to get better to feel peace. But God is showing you a different path. Seek presence first. Because when you position yourself in that place, something starts to line up inside you. The mind slows down, thoughts lose strength, and that constant restlessness begins to give way to a deep rest. It's not about ignoring reality. It's about not allowing it to dominate your inner self. And when that peace begins to be experienced, you realize that you no longer have to fight with your mind all the time, because there is something greater sustaining you. Before we move on, take this to a more personal level. If there is something that has taken away your peace, something that you feel needs God's intervention, write it in the comments as a prayer request. Put before God what is in your heart. Because when there is unity in faith, something powerful happens, and what seemed too heavy begins to be delivered into the right hands. There is a profound difference between trying to improve one's life and start a completely new life. Many people spend years trying to adjust behaviors, control thoughts, change attitudes, but they continue to feel the same inner weight, the same restlessness, the same difficulty in finding peace. Because deep down, they are trying to transform something old without realizing that God offers something totally new. And that's exactly what Jesus revealed in a conversation that changed everything. Nicodemus was someone who, to human eyes, already had everything. knowledge, position, respect, understanding of the scriptures. He was not someone lost, he was not someone without direction. But even so, there was something inside him that he was still looking for more. Something that made him go to Jesus in silence at night, perhaps trying to understand what his mind could not explain. And then Jesus said something that completely shattered any logical expectation. "Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." John 3:3. This statement does not point to an improvement, it points to a new beginning. It is not about adjusting the old mind, but about receiving a new mindset. It's not just about changing habits, it is to transform the root. And here's something that many haven't realized yet. It's not possible to live in peace with a mind that remains stuck in the same old patterns. You can even try to control your thoughts, you can even seek balance, but if the origin is not transformed, the cycle repeats itself. The new spiritual birth is exactly that. A change that starts from the inside out. This is when God not only guides your thoughts, but begins to renew the way you see everything. Your values change, your perception changes, your reactions change. That which once dominated your mind begins to lose strength, because there is a new life being formed within you. And this does not happen by human effort. Nicodemus tried to understand logically, he tried to explain with his mind, but Jesus was speaking of something that goes beyond natural understanding. It is a spiritual work. It is God generating something new where there were old limitations before. Maybe you're trying to find peace, struggling with thoughts, trying to organize everything inside you, but God is inviting you to something deeper. Not just controlling what you think, but allow Him to transform how you think. Because when this rebirth happens, something changes in a real way. The restlessness begins to subside, not because everything has been resolved around you, but because within you there is a new foundation being built. A basis that does not depend on circumstances, does not depend on control, does not depend on complete understanding. And this new life brings a new way of living, lighter, more confident, more aligned with God's presence. Maybe today what you need is not to try one more time, but start again in the right way. Because when God makes new, He doesn't just get better, it transforms completely. There is something that the human mind struggles to accept. Not everything that happens makes sense at the moment it happens. Unfair situations, moments of pain, experiences that seem completely out of place, and the more you think about it, the harder it becomes to find peace. Because the mind tries to organize everything logically, tries to understand the reason, tries to find explanations for what, many times, simply does not fit. And it is exactly at this point that many get lost. Thinking too much about injustices creates a dangerous cycle. You revisit what happened, remember words, relive situations, and, little by little, this begins to generate something even heavier: bitterness. A silent feeling that takes space within the heart and steals the lightness of the soul. But there is one truth that completely transforms this perspective. God does not lose control, not even when everything seems out of control. Joseph's story reveals this clearly. He was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, taken to a distant land, unjustly accused, imprisoned without charge. If anyone had every reason to question, to revolt, to get lost in thought, it would be Joseph. Because looking at it humanly, nothing made sense. But the most impressive thing is not what happened to him. It's how he interpreted all of this afterwards, when he finally came to the place that God had prepared, when everything began to unfold. He could have looked back with pain, with revolt, with resentment. But he saw something that few can see. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50:20. This statement changes everything, because Joseph did not deny what happened. He recognized that there was evil, injustice, pain, but he also recognized that, above all this, there was a greater purpose being led by God, and that's what brings peace. When you understand that God is able to transform even what was bad into something that works for a greater good, the mind stops fighting the past so much. You stop trying to make sense of every isolated detail, and you begin to trust that there is a plan being built, even when you don't see it completely. Maybe today you're stuck in something that happened, trying to understand why it was the way it was, why you had to go through it. But thinking too much about injustice will not bring rest. It will only increase the weight. Trusting in God's purpose, even without understanding everything, is what releases peace. And that doesn't mean ignoring the pain. It means not allowing it to define your future. Because just like in Joseph's life, there is something greater being prepared, something that is still aligning, something that will still make sense at the right time. If this message found you at a specific time, maybe it's because there's a purpose in it too. And if, deep down, you can see this, write in the comments, "God chose me." Because when you recognize that there is a bigger plan, everything starts to change, even before you see the end result. There is a pain that words cannot explain, a weight that does not show on the outside, but that tightens on the inside. And when this pain arrives, the mind tries to understand, tries to find answers, tries to organize what happened. But the more you think, the more tired you get. Because there are times when it's not the explanation that heals, it is consolation. And it is exactly in this place that many turn away from God, when in fact they should get even closer. There is a mistaken idea that one must be strong to draw close to God, that it is necessary to hide one's pain, to maintain an appearance of unshakable faith, as if suffering were a sign of spiritual weakness. But God never required it. He never asked for emotional perfection. He seeks sincerity. Job lived through one of the most intense scenarios of pain that anyone could face. He lost assets, lost family, lost health. And in the midst of all this, he also lost his understanding. Because suffering does not always come with a clear explanation. And it is precisely there that the mind tries to take action, questioning, looking for reasons, trying to make sense of what seems unfair. But Job's story isn't just about pain. It's about encounter. Even in the midst of deep suffering, something happened that changed everything. Job did not find immediate answers to everything he went through, but he found God's presence in a way he had never experienced before. And that transformed his inner scenery. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, 3, 4. Notice this carefully. God is not only the one who solves problems, He is the one who comforts in the midst of them. This means that you don't have to wait for everything to pass to feel relief. There is solace available now, in the midst of pain, in the midst of confusion, in the midst of what you do not yet understand. And that consolation doesn't come when you pretend to be well. It comes when you really open up. Maybe you've been trying to be strong for too long, trying to hide what he feels, avoid showing weakness, keep everything under control. But God does not approach appearance. It draws near to the broken heart. And it is exactly in this place of vulnerability that something profound happens. The presence of God enters, calms, sustains, brings a peace that does not depend on explanation. The mind may not even understand everything, but the heart begins to rest. Because God's comfort does not answer all questions, but it fills all the voids. Maybe today you don't need any more answers, need more presence. You don't need to understand everything. You just need to allow yourself to feel that you are not alone. And when this becomes real, the pain no longer has the same weight, because there is someone carrying along with you. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time. And this moment is not by chance. Continue to the end, because there is still something being prepared that can touch exactly that most sensitive area of your life and bring a kind of relief that you can't find anywhere else. There is an almost automatic desire within us to want clear signals all the time, something that confirms, proves, shows without a doubt which path to follow. Because deep down, the insecure mind always looks for reassurance before taking a step. And when these confirmations do not appear in the expected way, thoughts begin to multiply, bringing doubts, insecurity, and that feeling of being lost. But God, in His mercy, knows exactly this human limitation. He knows that we often need confirmations, not because faith depends on it, but because the heart is still learning to trust. And that is why, at times, He allows signs, small details, specific situations, answers that seem impossible, but that come as a way to strengthen trust. Gideon lived this very clearly. He received direction from God, but inside him there was still insecurity. He didn't ignore it. He presented before God. He asked for a sign, then he asked for another. Not out of rebellion, but out of the need for confirmation, and God answered, and God did so that night. For only the fleece was dry, and there was dew over all the earth. Judges 6:40, notice God's care at this moment. He did not reject Gideon for his doubt. He did not require perfect faith. He confirmed, strengthened, showed that he was there. And maybe you've experienced moments like this. Situations in which something happened in a specific, unexpected way, almost as a direct response to what you were looking for. Small signs that brought clarity, that calmed the heart for a moment. But there is an important point that cannot be ignored. The signs strengthen, but they do not sustain the journey. Because there comes a time when God will not continue to confirm everything in the same way. Not because it is no longer present, but because it wants to take you to a deeper level of trust. A level where you no longer rely on visible signs to follow, but learn to walk for the certainty of who He is. Overthinking arises just when you try to replace trust with constant assurance, when you need to see it to believe it, when you need proof to keep going. But mature faith begins when you decide to move forward even without new signs, just with the certainty that God has already spoken enough. And it completely changes the way you live. You stop relying on external confirmations all the time and begins to develop an inner security based on what God has already revealed. The mind slows down because it no longer needs to look for answers at every step. The heart is strengthened because it learns to trust beyond what it sees. Maybe today you're waiting for another sign, when in fact God has already given you enough direction to continue. And if this message has reached you, perhaps it is another one of those moments where God is speaking clearly to your heart. And to continue receiving words like this, which strengthen faith and bring direction, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because what you need to hear can come at exactly the right time, as this message did today. There is a level of faith that few reach, because it does not depend on results. Most people believe that trusting God is hoping that everything will work out, that the answer will come, that deliverance will happen exactly as desired. But what about when the situation becomes extreme? When there is no visible guarantee that everything will end well? It is at this point that true faith is revealed, because thinking too much about the consequences can weaken any conviction. The mind begins to calculate risks, imagine scenarios, predict losses. What if it doesn't work out? What if I lose everything? What if God doesn't act as I expect? These thoughts are growing, pressing, trying to negotiate the faith. And little by little, the temptation arises to retreat, to give in, to choose the path that is safest to human eyes. But there is a faith that does not negotiate. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were placed in just that place. Before them was a clear choice: deny the faith or face a fiery furnace. It was not a symbolic threat. It was real. The fire was prepared, the consequence was evident, the risk was total. And at that moment, their minds could have done the same as ours does today. They could have thought too much, analyzed possibilities, tried to find a more comfortable way out. They could have created justifications to preserve their own lives, but they chose something different. Behold, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us, and if not, you know that we will not serve your gods. Daniel 3:17-18. This statement reveals a level of trust that goes beyond common understanding. They weren't basing faith on the outcome. They were based on the conviction of who God is. They believed that God could deliver, but even if it didn't get rid of it in the expected way, their decision wouldn't change. This is unshakable faith. It's when you don't trade your trust regardless of what might happen. This is when you don't allow fear of consequences to determine your choices. This is when your fidelity does not depend on guarantees. And this directly confronts the restless mind, because thinking too much always tries to take you to control, to safety, to what seems most logical. But trusting in God takes courage. It requires standing firm even when the scenario is uncertain, even when there is no immediate confirmation that everything will work out. And it is exactly in this place that something powerful happens. Courage is born. Peace is established. The mind loses strength because it is no longer the mind that defines the path. It's trust. Perhaps today you are facing a situation where your faith is being tested, where there is pressure, doubt, fear of what can happen. But the question that remains is not about the result. It's about your position. You're going to negotiate, or will you trust it? Because when your faith ceases to depend on circumstances, it becomes unshakable. And it is at this level that you begin to experience something that goes beyond what the mind can explain. There is a type of battle that is not resolved with effort, planning, or human strength. And the problem is that when you don't understand this, the mind enters a cycle of trial and error, looking for strategies, creating plans, trying to anticipate movements, as if everything depended only on your ability to solve. But the more you try to control it, the heavier everything gets, because there are struggles that are not visible, but they are real. And while you try to win in the natural, God is calling you to see in the spiritual. Jehoshaphat faced a situation that, humanly speaking, was impossible to overcome. A large army was coming against him, a real concrete threat, with no apparent chance of victory. And at that moment, he could have done what any leader would do: gather strategies, prepare soldiers, try to figure out a way to resist. But he did something completely different. He sought God. And the answer he received did not point to a common strategy, pointed to a change in perspective. Do not be afraid or dismayed because of this great crowd, for the battle is not yours, but God's. 2 Chronicles 20:15. This statement completely breaks the logic of the anxious mind. Because the first reaction is to take control, to try to solve it, to think of all the possibilities. But God was saying, this fight is not yours. And this is where many get lost, because they continue to try to win battles that have already been delivered into God's hands. Jehoshaphat then makes a decision that seems unlikely. Instead of putting soldiers in front, he puts worshippers. Instead of advancing with weapons, he advances with flying colors. And that doesn't make sense to the logical mind. But it makes total sense in the spiritual, because while he was worshipping, something invisible was happening. God was fighting for him. The enemies began to confuse each other, to destroy each other, and by the time the people reached the battlefield, victory was already established. No direct human effort, no physical confrontation, no wear and tear. Because the strategy didn't come from the mind, it came from God. And this reveals something powerful for your life. Thinking too much about how to solve everything can limit what God wants to do. Because when you insist on controlling, you end up closing space for supernatural action. Trusting in God is not passivity, it's alignment. It is understanding when to act and when to deliver. It is recognizing that there are battles that you were not called to fight, but to trust. Maybe today you are facing something that seems too big, too difficult, too impossible. And your mind is trying to find a way out, a solution, a strategy. But what if this isn't a struggle for you to solve, but for God to act? When you change this position, something starts to happen. The pressure decreases, the weight is lightened, and confidence begins to take the place of despair. Because victory doesn't just depend on what you do, it depends on who is fighting for you. Few people will understand this message, but if it has reached you, there is a reason. Continue until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can show you exactly how to overcome what you can't solve on your own. There is a point in the spiritual journey when doing more does not solve it. Thinking more doesn't help. Trying to control it only makes it worse. And it is exactly in this place that many wear themselves out, because they continue to insist on acting when, in fact, what God expects is another posture. Not every battle is won with movement. Some overcome themselves with spiritual positioning. The restless mind always wants to do something immediate. Solve, respond, act, react. But there are situations in which any direct human action only adds to the confusion. And it is at this moment that a silent but powerful call arises. Stop trying to take matters into your own hands and start interceding. Moises lived this intensely. The people had gone astray, made wrong decisions, created a scenario that, humanly, no longer had a solution. The consequence was already established, the judgment seemed inevitable. And at that moment, Moses could have just accepted it, he could have moved on, he could have thought there was nothing more to do. But he did something different. He placed himself between God and the people. He interceded. Then the Lord repented of the evil which he had said he would do to his people. Exodus 32:14. This passage reveals something extremely profound. The prayer of a man aligned with the heart of God was able to change the course of a situation that seemed defined. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't force, it wasn't human argument, it was intercession. And this directly confronts the way many people deal with their problems today. Because when something happens, the first reaction is to overthink. Try to find solutions, imagine scenarios, look for quick answers. But this excess of thinking only generates weariness, tiredness, anxiety. The mind is overloaded, and even so, nothing is solved. But when you enter into intercession, something changes. You get out of human control and enters into spiritual alignment. Interceding is not just asking, it is to take a stand. It is to put that situation before God with intensity, with sincerity, with persistence. It is recognizing that there are things that you cannot change on your own, but that God can completely transform. And as you do that, the mind starts slowing down, because you no longer carry the weight of solving everything. You deliver, you trust, you allow God to enter into what seemed impossible. Maybe today you're trying to do too much, overthinking, carrying something that shouldn't be in your hands. And the invitation now is not to act more. It is to pray more. Because there are doors that only open in intercession. There are answers that only come when you decide to stop fighting with the mind and start aligning with God's heart. And it is in this place that the impossible begins to move, not by what you do, but by what God does when you choose to trust. There is something that may be feeding your restless mind without you realizing it. It's not just doubt. It's not just fear. It is the delay in obeying what God has already shown, Because every time you get a direction and you don't take action, the mind goes into a cycle of questioning. You start to think too much, analyze too much, reconsider, create possibilities, and what was simple becomes confusing. Late obedience always generates internal noise, and that's exactly why many people live mentally tired. Not because they have no direction, but because they are postponing what has already been revealed. And while they don't take a stand, the mind keeps working, trying to find other answers, trying to avoid the step that should have already been taken. But there is a secret that completely changes this scenario: immediate obedience. Felipe lived this clearly. He didn't receive a detailed plan. He didn't have full explanations. He didn't know what he would find on the way. He just received a simple direction from the Spirit. And the Spirit said unto Philip, Come near, and gather thyself unto that chariot. And Philip ran and heard. Acts 8:29-30. Notice this detail. Running. There was no delay. There was no prolonged analysis. There was no overthinking. There was an immediate response. And that's exactly what silences the mind. Because when you obey at the right time, you don't give room for doubt to grow. It does not allow fear to take shape. He does not let his thoughts create scenarios that do not even exist. You simply act, and on the way, everything starts to line up. Philip did not know that in that meeting there was such a great purpose. He did not know that that simple obedience would open doors, generate transformation, accomplish something much greater than he could imagine. But he only lived it because he decided not to overthink it, decided to obey. And maybe that's the point that's missing from your life right now. You already know what you need to do. You've already received direction. You've felt that inner touch. But it's postponing. And while you postpone, the mind continues to create doubts, weakening the decision, generating confusion. But when you decide to act, something changes instantly. Clarity appears, peace begins to emerge, and that restlessness loses strength. Because obedience aligns you with God, and where there is alignment, there is rest. Maybe today is not a day to think more. Let it be a day to obey. And if that message is bringing a confirmation you needed, don't let it pass. Write in the comments, I trust in God's action. Let this be your decision today, not just in words, but in attitude, walking in faith and letting God lead every step. There is a place where the mind finally finds silence. But this place is not found trying to solve everything, nor seeking external answers all the time. That place is intimacy with God. And this is a truth that many ignore, because they continue to seek peace in circumstances, in solutions, in explanations, when, in reality, peace begins when the heart draws near. Overthinking most of the time is not just a mental problem. It is a reflection of spiritual distance, because the farther you are from God's presence, the more the mind tries to compensate. He begins to seek control, to predict situations, to analyze everything in excess. But when you get closer, something naturally changes. The need to understand everything decreases, because confidence begins to grow. David understood this in a profound way. His life was not easy. He faced constant persecution, lived moments of real danger, was betrayed, rejected, surrounded by enemies. Humanly speaking, he had every reason to live anxious, restless, dominated by thoughts. But instead, he developed something that became the secret of his stability: intimacy with God. He was not only looking for answers, he was looking for presence. And that's why, even in the midst of chaos, he was able to declare confidence, rest, security. Because his peace did not come from what was happening around him, but from those who were with him in the middle of everything. The secret of the Lord is to them that fear him, and he will show them his covenant. Psalms 25:14. Notice that word, secret. There is something that is not accessed by mental effort, but by relationship. Something that is not revealed in haste, but in proximity. Something that is not found on the surface, but in intimacy. And maybe that's the point that's missing. You may be trying to resolve the restlessness in your mind with more thoughts, more analysis, more attempts to understand everything. But God is calling you to something deeper, to a place where you don't have to carry everything yourself, where you don't need to have all the answers, where you simply rest in presence, because it is in this place that the mind is silent. Not because all the problems have disappeared, but because the heart has found something greater than themselves. Intimacy breeds trust, and trust silences anxiety. The closer you get to God, the less room excessive thoughts find to dominate. And this does not happen automatically. It happens when you decide to prioritize that relationship, when you choose to stop for a moment, slow down, seek, listen, stay. Maybe today you don't need any more answers. Need more presence, because when you find that place, you realize that what worried you so much no longer has the same power. The mind rests, not because everything has been solved, but because you are no longer trying to solve everything yourself. There is a silent detail that often goes unnoticed, but which directly feeds anxiety. The attempt to solve everything on your own. It feels like strength. It feels like responsibility. It feels like maturity. But deep down, it may just be pride in disguise, a kind of self-sufficiency that puts on you a weight that was never yours to carry. And the more you take that control, the more the mind becomes overwhelmed, because you start to feel that everything depends on you. Every decision, every result, every detail, and this generates constant fatigue, an internal pressure that does not give rest. The mind does not stop because it believes it needs to handle everything. But the truth is that this position was never God's plan. He never called you to live sustaining everything with your own strength. He has called you to depend on Him. The story of King Uzziah reveals just such a point. He started well, sought God, was guided, prospered, overcame challenges. As long as he kept his heart aligned, everything flowed. But at a certain point, something changed. Not in circumstances, but within it. But when he had become strong, his heart was exalted to the point of being corrupted. 2 Chronicles 26:16. Notice this carefully. When he got stronger, when everything was going well, his heart lifted up. He began to trust himself more than he did God. And that was the beginning of the fall, because spiritual pride does not appear in an evident way. It manifests itself in a subtle way, when you begin to believe that you can do it on your own, that you understand everything, that you control everything. And without realizing it, he moves away from the dependence that once sustained his life. And it is at this point that anxiety grows, because the more you put yourself in the center, the more weight you carry, the more responsibility he assumes, the more control he tries to exercise. And the mind responds to this with restlessness, with overthinking, with a constant need to solve everything. But there is a completely different path. The path of humility. Humility is not weakness. It is recognition. It is to understand that you need God in every detail. It is giving up control, not out of inability, but out of trust. It is delivering what you cannot sustain alone. And when that surrender happens, something changes immediately. The mind slows down because it no longer needs to control everything. The heart calms down because it understands that it is not alone. The pressure decreases because the weight has been returned to those who can really carry it. Peace is born exactly in this place. In surrender, maybe today you are tired, not only because of the problems, but because of the constant attempt to solve everything yourself. And God is showing you that there is another way to live, a lighter, safer, more aligned shape, not based on your strength, but in dependence on Him. Because when you stop trusting only in yourself and start truly trusting in God, something fits inside you. And what once seemed too heavy, he begins, finally, to lose control over his mind. There is a silent pattern in the anxious mind that needs to be broken. She always focuses on what is missing, in what has not yet happened, in what has not yet been resolved, in what has not yet arrived. And the more you feed that focus, the more the restlessness grows. Because the mind is never satisfied with what it already has. She always finds something new to desire, to question, to worry about. And that's exactly why gratitude becomes such a powerful spiritual key. She changes the focus. Instead of looking at what hasn't happened yet, you begin to recognize what God has already done. And this is not just an emotional exercise, it is a spiritual positioning. Because when you give thanks, you are saying that you recognize God's action, even if there are still unresolved areas. The story of the 10 lepers reveals this clearly. Everyone was sick, everyone cried out for healing, everyone received the miracle. But only one returned. Only one interrupted the path, changed direction, and decided to recognize what had happened. And one of them, seeing that he was healed, returned, glorifying God with a loud voice, and he fell at the feet of Jesus with his face to the ground, giving thanks to him. Luke 17:15-16. Notice this detail. He saw that he was cured, he noticed, and this perception generated a response. While the others remained focused perhaps on what they would still do, on what they would still live, that man stopped to recognize what he had already received. And that makes all the difference. Because gratitude doesn't just acknowledge the past, it strengthens the present and transforms the future. It adjusts the way you see life. What once seemed insufficient is starting to gain value. What was ignored begins to be seen more clearly, and the mind, little by little, begins to slow down. Because when you practice gratitude, you break the cycle of mental scarcity. You stop feeding thoughts based on lack and begin to strengthen a vision based on provision. And this generates peace, not because everything is perfect, but because your heart is aligned. Maybe today you are so focused on what has not yet happened that you have stopped realizing how much God has already done. Small things, big deliverances, silent answers. All of this may be going unnoticed, while the mind insists on looking only at what is missing. But when you change that look, something starts to change inside you. Anxiety loses strength, faith is strengthened, confidence grows, because you begin to realize that God has not been absent. He was present the whole time, and it transforms the way you live in the now. Peace is not born when everything is resolved. It grows when the heart learns to give thanks in any circumstance. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that could become a game changer in how you deal with your thoughts and your faith. Stay tuned, because this may be exactly the sign you needed to experience real change. There is a moment in the walk with God that few are prepared to face, when you don't feel anything. No strong emotion, no visible confirmation, no immediate response. It's as if everything is silent, and it is exactly at this point that the mind begins to work against you. Because when there is no feeling, the mind tries to fill the void with doubts. Is it still worth it? Is God listening? Will something happen? These thoughts begin to emerge subtly but steadily. And if you don't notice, they weaken your faith little by little until the will to continue begins to diminish. But here's a life-changing truth. Your walk with God can't depend on how you feel. It needs to depend on the decision you keep. Jesus told a parable that reveals just that. The story of a widow who sought justice before an unjust judge. Humanly speaking, she had no influence, no power, no advantage at all. Everything indicated that she would not be attended, but she had something that made all the difference: perseverance. She continued, even without an immediate response, even without clear signs, even without guarantees. Day after day she returned, insisted, stayed. And it was this constancy that changed the result. And shall not God avenge his elect, who cry unto him day and night, though he be slow with them? Luke 18:7. Understand this in depth. The answer may not come in the time you expect, but that doesn't mean it won't come. The problem is that the restless mind does not like to wait. She wants to feel something now. She wants to see something now. She wants to be sure now. And when that doesn't happen, she starts suggesting giving up. But true faith is not supported by emotions. It is sustained by constancy. There are days when you will feel motivation, presence, clarity, but there will also be days when none of this will be evident. And it is exactly on these days that perseverance becomes essential. Keep praying even if you don't feel it. Keep trusting even without seeing. To keep walking even without understanding. Because it is in this process that faith is strengthened. Thinking too much in these moments can lead you to give up, because the mind will always try to convince you that it's not working, that there's no point in continuing. But when you decide to stay, something starts to build inside you, a firmer faith, more mature, more resistant. And this faith is not easily shaken, because it does not depend on circumstances or feelings. It depends on an ongoing decision to trust God, regardless of what is happening. Maybe today you are not feeling the same as before. Maybe it's harder, quieter, more challenging. But that doesn't mean that God has stepped aside. It means that you are being strengthened, because spiritual victory does not come only to those who start with faith. It comes to those who decide to continue. There is a battle that happens every day inside your mind, and it is not overcome only with silence or an attempt to ignore thoughts, because the more you try not to think, the more thoughts seem to gain strength. And this happens because there is a spiritual principle that many have not yet understood. The mind does not align itself just by avoiding error. It is transformed when it is confronted by the truth. And this is exactly where spiritual authority comes in. You weren't called just to endure thoughts. He was called to rule over them. And that authority comes not from your mental strength, but from the Word of God that you declare and establish within yourself. Jesus showed this clearly in the desert. He was in a moment of physical vulnerability, after days of fasting, in an environment of spiritual pressure. And in that scenario, temptations, thoughts, suggestions arose that tried to distort the truth. The enemy did not appear with physical force, appeared with words. And Jesus answered in the same way, with words. But they were not ordinary words. They were words loaded with truth. It is written, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Matthew 4:4. Understand this in depth. Jesus did not argue. He did not argue with human logic. He did not enter into mental debate. He declared the word. He brought out a truth that nullified any contrary thought. And this reveals something powerful. Thoughts are not overcome only with silence, are defeated with positioning. Maybe you've tried to fight negative thoughts just by ignoring it, trying to distract yourself, trying to avoid it. But there is a more effective way. Replace. Confront each thought with a greater truth. When fear says it won't work, the Word says God is in control. When doubt arises, the Word affirms the promises. When insecurity tries to dominate, God's truth establishes identity. And the more you state that, the more your mind aligns. Because the mind cannot dominate when it is submissive to the truth. There is a liberated authority when you open your mouth and declare what God has already said. It's not just repetition, it is spiritual positioning. It is to bring to reality what has already been established in the spiritual world, and this completely changes the internal environment. Thoughts begin to lose strength, confusion decreases, clarity increases, not because everything around you has changed, but because inside you there is a truth stronger than any doubt. Maybe today you're trying to fight in silence, when God is calling you to declare, to use the word as a weapon, as a foundation, as a direction, because when the truth is established, the lie does not hold. And it is in this place that the mind finds order, not by the absence of thoughts, but by the presence of the truth that governs everything within you. There is an invitation that is available every day, but that many ignore without realizing it. Not because they don't want peace, but because they have become accustomed to living carrying weights they should never carry. The racing mind, the constant thoughts, the worry that gives no rest. All of this is treated as something normal, as if it were an inevitable part of life, but it is not. There is a real, deep rest available, and it does not depend on everything being resolved. It depends on a decision. Jesus made this clear in a direct way, without complication, without impossible demands. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. Notice the simplicity and, at the same time, the depth of this invitation. He didn't say solve it first. He didn't say organize everything. He didn't say understand completely. He said, come. But this is exactly where many get stuck. Because even though they are tired, they continue to try to solve everything before approaching. They continue to carry worries, trying to control situations, thinking too much about everything, as if they needed to take care of it before resting, and this creates an exhausting cycle. You get tired, you try to solve it, you overload yourself even more, you think too much, and he is still tired. Because rest is not in solving everything, is in delivering. Overthinking is a burden, an invisible weight, but extremely real. And the most dangerous thing is that you can carry this around for so long that you start to think it's normal. But God has never asked that of you. Spiritual rest is a choice. It's the moment when you decide to stop trying to control everything and start to truly trust, not just in words, but in attitude. It's when you surrender what's out of your reach and accept that you don't need to have all the answers right now. And when that delivery happens, something changes immediately. The mind begins to slow down. The pressure decreases. The heart finds relief that comes not from external solutions, but from an internal presence. It's as if, for the first time, you realize that you don't have to carry everything yourself. But this rest is not automatic. It needs to be accepted. Jesus offers but does not force. He invites but does not impose. And many are still tired, not because rest does not exist, but because they have not yet decided to release what they are holding. Perhaps today is the time to do so, to stop thinking so much, to try to control so much, to carry so much, and just go to Him with everything that's heavy inside of you, because the relief you seek is not in solving everything. It is in trusting. At the end of this video, you can try something that goes beyond words, a real feeling of lightness, peace, presence. Stay until the end, because that moment can mark a profound change within you. There is a level of confidence that is only achieved when you reach the limit of yourself. It's no longer about understanding. It's no longer about trying to adjust. It's no longer about finding a comfortable way out. It is the moment when all human possibilities seem insufficient, and all that remains is an inner decision, total surrender. But this is also the most difficult point, because as long as there is still some form of control, the mind tries to cling to it. It wants to negotiate, it wants to find alternatives, it wants to avoid the most painful path. And that's exactly why many remain restless. Because they haven't completely let go yet. Jesus showed this in a profound way in Gethsemane. There was no crowd there were no miracles happening, there were no immediate answers. There was silence, pressure, anticipated pain. He knew what was coming. He felt the weight of that moment in a real, intense way. And humanly, he expressed it. Father, if you are willing, let this cup pass from me. This is not a phrase of weakness. It is a sincere expression. It is the recognition that the path was difficult, and this reveals something important. Trusting in God does not mean not feeling the weight of situations. It does not mean the absence of internal struggle, but what comes after changes everything. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Luke 22:42. Here is the highest point of delivery. Even feeling, even knowing the pain, even without an easier path, he chose to submit, not to what was comfortable, but to what was right. Not to what seemed best to human eyes, but to the Father's will. And it is exactly in this place that the mind finds peace. Because as long as you try to maintain control, the restlessness remains. As he insists that things go his way, the tension continues. But when the heart finally says, "Thy will be done," something aligns. The internal struggle decreases. Not because everything became easy, but because you stopped resisting. Maybe today there is something that you are still trying to control, trying to change, trying to avoid. And this has kept his mind agitated, his thoughts racing, his heart tired. But the peace you seek may be in exactly what you have not yet fully surrendered. Total surrender is not losing, it is trusting. It's recognizing that God sees beyond, that he knows what he's doing, that even when you don't understand, he's still in control. And when this surrender really happens, something deep changes inside you. Anxiety loses strength, fear decreases, and a silent peace begins to occupy the space that was previously taken by worry. Perhaps this is the time to take that step. And if that word has touched something within you, if there is a decision being formed in your heart right now, then answer it simply but sincerely. Write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Because sometimes a statement can mark the beginning of a delivery that transforms everything. Everything that has been revealed so far leads us to an inevitable point. It is not enough to understand, it is necessary to deliver, because true change doesn't happen when the mind accumulates knowledge, but when the heart surrenders completely to God. After recognizing the weight of thoughts, the need for trust, and the power of surrender, it is time to turn all of this into a real spiritual act. The mind that was once full is now invited to empty, not by force, not by effort, but by surrender. This is where you stop carrying alone what was never yours to sustain. This is where control gives way to trust, and anxiety finds a way out. God's word reminds us of this clearly. Throw all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. 1 Peter 5:7. There is care available. There is a God who not only observes, but sustains, welcomes, and responds. And all he expects now is for you to take that step of surrender. So at this moment, don't think anymore. Just open up. Let's pray, putting before God everything that has weighed on your mind and allowing him to bring you the peace you need so much. Beloved Father, your word promises us a peace that the world cannot give. And it is in this truth that we now stand before you, with open hearts and thirsting for your presence. Lord, after all that has been reflected, all that has been revealed, we recognize that we need you more than ever. We thank you, God, for every teaching, for every direction, for every silent touch that has spoken to our inner self throughout this journey. Thank you that even when the mind is agitated, your spirit remains steadfast, bringing light where there was once confusion. Lord, we ask you now for strength and wisdom. It teaches us to live everything we learn. It gives us courage to trust when we don't understand, to obey when it's hard, and to rest when the mind wants to quicken. May we remember in every moment that control is not in our hands, but in yours, and that this is a reason for peace, not fear. Father, look at every person who is praying right now. He visits every heart. It brings healing to those who are emotionally tired, to those who carry silent pains, to those who have struggled with thoughts that do not cease. It brings provision for those facing financial difficulties, opens doors where there seems to be no way out. It restores families, strengthens relationships, brings reconciliation where there has been estrangement. And for those who face illness, Lord, pour out your healing, touch with your power, and renew your strength. At this moment, in silence, each heart stands before you. Every request, every tear, every need, all is now being delivered into your hands. Lord, we have decided to deliver. Surrender our worries, our fears, our plans, our paths. We deliver what we understand and especially what we cannot understand. May your will prevail in our lives because we know that it is perfect, pleasant, and good. It teaches us to trust truly, not only when everything is fine, but especially when we face challenges. May your peace, which passeth all understanding, now invade every mind, calm every thought, and bring deep rest to the soul. As it is written, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give it to you as the world gives. John 14:27. May this peace be real, alive, and constant within us. And if that prayer expresses what is in your heart, declare it in faith. Write Amen as a sign of your surrender, and also present your request, because together in prayer we believe that God is at work. In Jesus' name, Amen. Throughout this journey, one truth has become clear. Thinking too much has robbed the peace of many, but trusting in God is the way to restore the soul. Every teaching you heard here was not by chance. Every story, every verse, every reflection carries a powerful spiritual key, capable of completely transforming the way you live. This message is for you. God has chosen you to hear this today because He knows exactly what has been going on inside your mind and heart. The question now is no longer to understand. It's decide. Will you keep trying to control everything, or will you finally give up? Will you continue to feed thoughts that imprison you, or will you choose to trust the one who has control of all things? Stop for a moment and think, what do you need to surrender today to live the peace that God has already promised? And you know, it's very special to have you here so far. It shows that there is something inside you seeking more, seeking change, seeking God in a true way. And I am very happy that we are together on this journey. I want to make you a simple but important invitation. Leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are not subscribed yet, and activate the bell to continue receiving messages like this. But more than that, I want to hear from you. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share what you have been experiencing. Your story matters, and there is a community here ready to pray with you and for you. You are not alone in this journey, and it doesn't stop here. There's something even deeper waiting for you in the next video. Let's continue to move forward together, understanding how to live this trust in God in a practical way, and how to experience a peace that does not depend on circumstances. The next step of your transformation may be exactly in the next video that is already available here on the channel, and I want to walk with you in that direction. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life and see you in the next video.